Welcome to episode 231 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelt out, seven-health.com/231. Just a note before we get started, I'm currently taking on new clients, and at the time of recording this, I have just a couple of spots left. So this will be the last time I mention this on the podcast for a while. I specialize in helping clients overcome eating disorders, disordered eating, chronic dieting, body dissatisfaction and negative body image, over-exercise or exercise compulsion, and dealing with irregular cycles or cycles that have ceased altogether. If these are areas that you struggle with and you'd like help making them a thing of the past, then please get in contact. You can head over to seven-health.com/help. And there you can read about how I work with clients and apply for a free initial chat. So the address again is seven-health.com/help. And I'll also include that link in the show notes. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist that specializes in recovery from disordered eating and eating disorders, and really helping anyone who has a messy relationship with food and body and exercise. So this week on the show, it is a guest episode, and my guest today is Louise Adams. So Louise is a clinical psychologist who works in private practice from her home in Sydney, Australia, and has been practicing in the field for more than 20 years. She has written 2 books, Mindful Moments and the Non-Diet Approach Handbook for Psychologists and Counsellors, which she wrote with Fiona Willer. She's also the founder of UNTRAPPED, which is a masterclass for those who desire freedom from diet prison. Louise is the Vice President of Health at Every Size Australia and is also a member of the Australian Psychological Association and a member of the Clinical College of the APS. She has a special interest in problematic eating, body image and weight struggles. Louise fights to educate people about the cruel trap of dieting, which only sets us up to fail. She uses an evidence-based anti-dieting approach to empower people to achieve permanent lifestyle changes. Louise is wholly committed to Health at Every Size movement and to spreading the word about shifting our attitudes about weight and health. Louise is determined to make a difference in changing society's perceptions about health, diets, weight loss, and bodies. And she believes that people can approach health and happiness without attaching it to weight loss. She is for body diversity and against fat prejudice. So I became aware of Louise in the last year. It was actually while doing some research with the podcast with Fiona Willer, and Fiona Willer was obviously a past guest, and as I mentioned in the bio, she's written a book with Fiona Willer, and Louise has a podcast called All Fired Up, and I started listening to it and I loved what she was doing, and I actually talk about this with her in the intro as well as going on to what we're going to cover as part of the episode, so I won't repeat myself here. Louise is a fantastic guest, and I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. So here is my conversation with Louise Adams. Hey Louise, welcome to Real Health Radio. I'm pleased to be chatting with you today, or tonight in your case.
Yep, thank you so much for having me. It's tonight, it's Friday night, and I'm in the mood for a good chat.
Awesome. So look, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, All Fired Up, and I highly recommend that my listeners check it out. And what I like about the show is that you really take a detailed look at specific topics, and I can tell just how much time you put into them and the level of research that you do as part of them. And so as part of today's show, I want to focus on 2 of the topics that you've covered on the show and see if we can go into them in some level of depth. One is the horrific fast track trial with intermittent fasting and teenagers. And then the other is the incredible work you've done investigating the Obesity Collective and Novo Nordisk. And both of these, for your podcast, were double episodes of the show. So we're definitely not going to run out of things to say with these.
I think you've just mentioned the 2 biggest rabbit holes I've ever fallen down. But yeah.
But yeah, I'd also just like to find out about you and your practice and your background and how you got into Health at Every Size and the non-diet movement. So yeah, to start with, do you want to give listeners a bit of background on yourself, who you are, what you do, what training you've done?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Louise Adams. I'm a clinical psychologist in Sydney, Australia, and coincidentally grew up quite near you, which is interesting.
Yeah, we discovered before we hit record that we probably lived about 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away from one another for the first, 20 years of our life.
That's just such a small world. Oh my God. So after I grew up and went to uni, I did psychology. I did my clinical masters. I did a lot of years. I was in jail. I did my kind of, I guess, cut my baby teeth as a psychologist in jail, which was really, I think, interesting and formative for me, but wasn't a long-term thing, and ended up in private practice. And when I set up the private practice, like early 2000s, I wasn't a specialist in this area, but everyone that I saw, like literally everyone that I saw, had issues with their body, or disordered eating, or wanted to lose weight, or, a full-blown eating disorder, or, a mixture of all of the above. And I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't expect this, but it was everywhere. And as a clinical psychologist, I knew, I was trained in the treatment of eating disorders, but certainly no one had talked about weight loss at university. So being a good, evidence-based scientist, I fell down my first rabbit hole of, I guess, researching, well, if people want to lose weight, how can we do that safely and ethically? And also without, if people have an eating disorder, what on earth do we do there? And that was like literally a huge rabbit hole of weight loss research, in which I discovered that there was basically diets don't work, that weight loss attempts, if they're quote unquote successful, will only last a few months, and then our bodies start fighting back, and that's why we regain the weight. And I was blown away by this, because it's like, well, like for me, it was like discovering all of the science on climate change, and then looking around and going, hang on, why are we still using fossil fuel? It's like, why are we still offering and normalizing this thing? Because I'd found out not only that they don't work, and they don't work not because of willpower or anything like that. They don't work because our bodies are smarter than any diet. But also the dieting was like the number one predictor of an eating disorder. And there's just no safe way to encourage people to pursue weight loss without massively increasing their risk of disordered eating, particularly if you do this, at certain times in your life. So I was kind of left a bit bereft with this knowledge, and I felt so alone, of like, okay, well, what the hell do I do now? And then I found this awesome book called If Not Dieting, Then What? By Dr. Rick Korsman, who's an Aussie GP who was a real trailblazer here in Australia for the non-diet approach. And I just loved the book. I remember flying down to Melbourne, doing his training, like basically befriended him, and, we ended up being really good friends. And then I found out about Health at Every Size, and then I found out about the work of Dr. Lindo Bacon and the whole social justice movement that underpins Health at Every Size. And it just, like, when you just sort of hit on, okay, this is exactly what I've been looking for, because this is, I've been looking for an ethical way to help people who are struggling in this area. And that was kind of the beginning for me. So I've been doing this in private practice, like a long time. And now, well, gosh, since the pandemic, I've been online for a year, and I'm just starting to kind of claw my way back out into the sunlight, and I'm opening some new offices, like for in real life consults, which is kind of exciting and a bit nerve-wracking to come back into the real world, because I do a lot of online work. I have an online program called UNTRAPPED, which helps people kind of learn how to not diet and how to push back against diet culture online, because not everyone can afford to come and see a psychologist. Not everyone can travel to come and see a psychologist. And I kind of created UNTRAPPED as well, because, like, for me, this whole process of the not diet, anti-diet stuff, HAZE community, it's been about community and connecting with other people who understand it, because, there's such pressure from, the climate change deniers in weight-centric thinking. So the online program helped me to kind of create a place where people who are doing this, like in their own lives, could connect with each other.
Yeah.
So it's been a lovely online community that I've developed, but I've also got the private practice. So I'm quite busy.
Yeah. And I mean, just on that, like online side of things, I mean, from speaking to other practitioners in Australia, I know that there is quite a good health at every size movement in Australia, but depending on where you are, that might not be true for your local area. And I work with clients all over the world, and there's people I'm working with, say in Germany, that are like, people have never even heard of any of this. Like this hasn't even infiltrated into the country. And so to have options where someone can be in a different location and then be able to work with you or get into your program, like I think that can be a godsend when there isn't a local option for someone.
Oh, that's exactly why I did it, because like it can be so isolating if you're the only one kind of starting to wake up from all of this. Everyone else is still drinking the Kool-Aid. So, and we do, like we've got members who are like the one person in their country who are like, I think this way, but I've got no one to talk to. So it's and it's so powerful, because I don't think I could do half the stuff that I do if I didn't have the support of the HAES community here in Australia, because they're not just my colleagues, they're my friends.
Yeah, definitely. It does. You need that support, because in so many ways you are going against the normal narrative, and you are very much bucking the trend.
I love bucking the trend.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like it feels like I started out in a similar way to you, where you said, okay, you set up private practice and you in a sense didn't necessarily know which way you were going to go. And then all of these people just showed up, where it was either about weight loss or dieting or disordered eating or eating disorders. And that was the same with me. I finished studying as a nutritionist and didn't really know in what area I was going to go. And it was just that they were the people who started showing up more often than not. And that was the area that I actually discovered I really liked working in. And then it kind of just went from there, because that's the thing that I'm then writing about in blog posts or starting to talk about as part of the podcast. But yeah, you just kind of see how much of a need there is for this kind of work. Yeah,
there's so much of a need. And for me, psychology often spends a lot of time looking for the kind of quote unquote fault or pathology in an individual.
Yeah.
And, harking all the way back to my days in jail, I knew that people just belong in context, that the forces that are bigger than us operate on us. So, and that's something that I think really resonated with Health at Every Size, because it's a social justice movement. So we can help individuals to, maybe look at their relationship with food or movement, but without seeing it in the big context and the forces at play, and without kind of fighting back against that. We can't, it's really hard to help people heal in a culture that's so toxic. So I kind of have, I guess, taken it a little bit personally that I need to do advocacy. I need to do more than seeing people individually, trying to band-aid the wound that's caused by all of this shit that's going on in diet culture.
Yeah, and I also like the fact that you're not trying to identify why a person is broken, but more like, okay, let's look at all the positive parts here, or like how you came to be in this situation and how the external influences are having an impact on this. Like I'm a big fan of the whole positive psychology movement. I think that's coming from a really good place. Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm in agreement with that.
I think I see it more from a trauma lens, that because that phrase that medicine might ask, what's wrong with you, but through a trauma lens, we ask, what happened to you?
Yep.
What have you been through? And seeing the functionality in behaviours that people, might at first think are just wrong or pathological, like binge eating is a good example. So people might come saying, I'm binge eating and it's terrible and dreadful, but may not be able to see or make sense of actually that binge eating behavior is really functional. It's doing something for you, you know. And so seeing the logic in it, seeing the function in it, rather than just seeing it as some kind of pathology or disease.
Totally. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Gabor Mate and a lot of his writing around addiction and the way that, he thinks about, like, not why the addiction, but why the pain.
Yeah.
And looking at it from that lens. And again, like, yes, you're completely correct of, like, whatever someone is doing, however much damage it is causing in all the areas of their life, there is A, positive intent with it, and B, they are getting something out of that. And so let's figure out what that is so that we can either A, meet that same need in some other more constructive way, or B, what would have to change so that need is no longer so important. Really using what's going on as a guide of, like, okay, there's something here, let's understand this, as opposed to just saying, like, just stop doing that. That's a really stupid thing to do.
Yeah, or, you know, what you're doing is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
always a function. And that's and curiosity, you know, it's looking at everything through the lens of curiosity rather than judgment. Yeah. And that's another thing that I'm sure you see as well. Like, everybody that comes in is full of judgment for their towards their body, or judgment towards their behaviors with food or exercise. And I always think, you know, judgment is so disinterested. Judgment just slams the door and says, you're doing it wrong, you know, come back when you're fixed. And curiosity is like swinging the door open and going, this is really fascinating. So trying to pretend that what you're doing is interesting rather than wrong. Yeah.
I mean, look, curiosity is a word that I repeat again and again when working with clients. And like, let's treat this as an experiment, or let's see what you can notice, and like try and, in a sense, there is no way of doing this wrong. Whatever happens, this is something you can learn from it. Because I think if you're always in this mode of, I've got to get this perfectly right, 99 times out of 100, that's not gonna happen. Whereas if there's that curiosity, it's like, you know what, whatever happens, it's fine. We can learn from this. And I think just that shift in how someone thinks has the kind of trickle down effect that people start to do behaviors or act in a way that is more in alignment with their values, or is more in alignment with recovery.
Yeah, there's just a potential there when you start getting curious. Yeah. Which kind of gets smashed by judgment.
Yeah. So you said that when you started in private practice and you started to investigate dieting, and if there is a way of doing this in an ethical way, is there a way of doing this that is sustainable? It sounds as though that's your first entry into dieting, but in terms of your own personal experience, if we go back to you as a kid or as a teenager, did you have lived experience with dieting?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm a human female. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, so many diets. I was always a very small human, but still someone who felt the need to restrict food and felt guilty around food. So I guess, like, if I saw me, I would classify me as a disordered eater from way back. And, you know, not a funny story, this is a dreadful story, but opening my first private practice, when was it? Like 2006 or maybe 2005. For some reason, I was convinced that I needed to open the private practice and transition from, like, working in jail. And along that path, I needed to lose X amount of kilos. Like this, I literally don't know where this came from, but I dutifully did it. I think it was Lightneasy or one of those. Oh, it was Jenny Craig. Yeah. So I lost the X amount of kilos, opened the practice, immediately put it back on again. And that's when I started the research. Okay. So I was kind of coming off my own experience of, like, a really crystallized example of how just it doesn't work. But totally. I mean, I don't know anyone who hasn't dieted or restricted their food. I don't know. And, you know, one of my clients, the one who had the most, I think she counted 500 diets.
Wow.
That she'd been on in her life.
That's insane.
So, yeah. And when you ask people, again, about their dieting experience, you will hear what the science says, which is, you lose a bit and then it comes straight back on. And over time, it creeps up and up and up, and you're kind of feeling worse and worse about yourself. And what we're not being told is, the truth about weight loss dieting is that it's just an ineffective and harmful practice. And I wish it was illegal. But we got a way to go now, haven't we?
Yeah, we do. Or if it wasn't illegal, have proper informed consent.
Informed consent, exactly.
These are the real statistics on it. This is what happens. This is what happens 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out. And if you still want to pursue it, fine. Like the same way as there is a pretty blatant pretty blatant messages and pictures on a packet of cigarettes. Like there is no one now these days who starts smoking that is unaware of that. And I guess if you're still going into that situation and smoking, that's fine. But dieting should be in the same realm of that, of like, okay, if you still want to do this, that's okay, but you need to know all of this upfront.
Yeah. And not just the impact on weight regain, but the biological impact on things like metabolism, on hormones, on growth. If you're in your, childhood, teen years, there's so much information that we know that's literally not being mentioned. You very rarely read something in the media, for example, that gives an honest overview of dieting. We only ever hear the diet honeymoon periods being presented as inspiration. We don't hear what happens after the honeymoon. Yeah,
totally. I mean, I was speaking to a past client recently, and she is in her, I'm trying to remember her age, late 50s, early 60s. But yeah, she had either dieted or had disordered eating for a really, really long time of her life. And she's now at a place where she's like, my bones are shot to bits. And she's like, they are so brittle, and I'm in a really bad way because of this. I'm terrified of getting another DEXA scan because I don't know what that's gonna show. And no one would have said throughout her life, like, this needs to be changed. Every step along the way, it was praised, and gosh, I wish I could have your willpower, I wish I could have your body, or that kind of stuff. And she's now living with a situation where she's past the point of menopause. There's probably some bits and pieces that she can do now to help, but it's in a lot of ways the damage has been done.
Yeah, that's right. When you lose your bone density, you're done. We can't do anything to mend that. And that's actually a really good point. We never hear about the risk of osteoporosis from chronic dieting, but it's really real. Yeah,
it really is. And then, I mean, the other one that should terrify people more than it really does is how it affects cognitive function and your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's and dementia and those kind of diseases, which for me is potentially one of the scariest things to lose your mind in that way. And from a place of being, I don't know, just realistic and sane about it, like, you're losing your mind at an early age for what? To be thinner.
Yeah, well, it's thin at all costs, isn't it? Yeah, it's thin at all costs. We like literally are seeing an explosion in gastric surgery, which is so invasive, completely irreversible, and has an enormous impact on people's ability to absorb nutrients, which is like pretty fundamental need.
Yeah.
And that's at all costs.
Yeah.
And that's what breaks my heart, that we're not being more critical about, I mean, why is that preferable to learning to live in a world where we have body diversity? I don't understand.
Yeah, well, it's also the stats on that blow my mind as well. I think, and maybe I'm getting these slightly wrong, so these aren't the exact stats, but with bariatric surgery, it's like 1 in 200 people will die in surgery or as part of that surgery, and that still goes ahead. But when fen-phen, the drug for weight loss drug, was pulled from the market, it was something like 1 in 15,000 people would get issues with their heart. I can't even remember exactly what it was doing, but 1 in 15,000 was enough for them to say, hey, we cannot sell this drug anymore. It needs to be pulled from the market. And yet 1 in 200 people die from bariatric surgery. And it's like, okay, no, that seems like a fair ratio.
Well, yeah, that's because we've devalued the existence of larger bodied people to the point of insinuating that that's a cost that is bearable. It's terrible.
Yeah.
But that's, you're just talking about the death rate in surgery.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So the death rate of people from suicide following surgery is actually terrifying. I've even written a blog about this. A research paper from WA found after weight loss surgery, people were 2 to 3 times more likely to be hospitalised for psychiatric illness, as also increased risk of psychoactive substance abuse, mood, neurotic behaviour, personality, and schizophrenia-like symptoms.
Yeah.
But a 5-fold increase in people presenting to hospital rooms for deliberate self-harm, and 10% of all post-op deaths were suicide. So, and you know what? You were talking about that comparison with fen-phen. We have black box warnings on antidepressants for, the suicide risk. And there's no black box warning on weight loss surgery. People literally don't know about this, but it's really quite well established now.
Wow. Yeah. And it makes sense. Like when someone is deprived of energy, deprived of vitamins, minerals, calories, etc., there are things that happen across the board and that are well studied. I mean, you look at the Minnesota starvation experiment and all the symptoms that arose as part of that. You're doing the exact same thing when someone's having that surgery. You just don't know it because you're like, well, they're in a larger body. They've got lots of stuff on their body that they can use as energy, so everything's going to be fine. And the reality is that is just not true. And so, you increase psychosis, you increase all of these things that are hallmarks of malnutrition and starvation. But we're like, no, this is a good thing to do.
This is the golden ticket, right? Let's increase the funding. Let's give it to more people and younger people. Yeah. Let's do that. It's just truly upsetting that more of a fuss isn't being made about this, because I think it's just really abhorrent kind of stuff. Yeah, no, I agree. Which then kind of segues nicely. Let's talk about the fast track trial then. Speaking of horrific stuff. Exactly. So, I guess to start with, do you want to describe what fast track trial is? Or is or was? Like that was the thing I'm not sure of where it's up to. Sadly, it still is. Okay. So a few years ago, I was at an eating disorders conference, and one of the psychologists in our community was given an achievement award. And this is a lovely woman who has done a lot of body image research in the area of eating disorders and disordered eating. Then one of the participants in the audience noticed that this same researcher was involved in something called the fast track trial, which is the first I'd heard of it. When I did hear the details, I was kind of horrified, because it's essentially an extreme weight loss experiment with Australian teenagers. So kids aged 13 to 17, they're looking to recruit somewhere close to 200 teens to do what they're calling an intermittent fasting. That's hence a fast track. So, it's about putting kids on very restrictive diets for a month. So for the first month, all of the kids have basically a liquid diet, opt to fast. And then for a year, so for an entire year, these kids are going to be put either on two groups. One's the intermittent fasting group, where a few times a week they'll be starved down to the level. I'm not going to mention the calorie level because it's too triggering, but it's essentially below that of what a toddler needs. And then the rest of the time, encouraged to quote unquote eat healthily.
Yeah.
And the control arm is I think it's still calorie restricted, but not intermittently.
Yeah,
so
it's still pretty calorie restricted. I mean, it's still low calories. Like in either group does not sound fun.
These are teenagers.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are teenagers. And, I have one. And they're supposed to grow.
Yeah.
And to inflict, like it is a starvation diet. This is the definition of someone being put into a starvation state. Not just for like 6 weeks. I mean, I'm not saying 6 weeks would even be good, but for an entire year of their lives, this is what the kids were being asked to do. So horrified was kind of the eating disorder community's reaction to this, because it's 2020. Well, no, it was 2018, I think, back then. But we knew. It's like, let's try the Minnesota starvation experiment on kids and see what happens. Because, and I had a chat to the psychologist who was involved, and she was saying, oh, but intermittent fasting showing some great results out of the States. And it was just kind of like a really surreal moment of denial of the reality. Really, of that dieting is the number one predictor of developing an eating disorder for kids. And here we are, not just doing a little diet, we're doing an extreme, long-lasting diet.
Yeah. With the Minnesota starvation experiment, it was 26 weeks as opposed to a whole year. And at least going into that, the point of it was to understand what happens when people are starved, to see how they could best support the rest of the world if everyone was going into famine after the World War. And so it was understanding what happens when someone is in a famine state. The idea of this is like, can we do this thing and then get everyone doing it because we think it's good for health? And that's a completely different scenario. Yeah.
Let's do the thing that, the justification was that it was based on adult research showing long-term efficacy. And that was, the first point that I tackled in my complaint to the ethics committee that approved it, that it's by no means proven in adults to be effective in the long term, as no diet has been.
Yeah.
But that is what they were saying to justify using fasting. It's just so terrible on so many levels. You're right. Like, there was, at least a noble cause underlying the Minnesota.
Yeah.
And we didn't know. But we know, it's 70 years of research. We know if we put kids on a really restrictive diet for an entire year, we're going to screw up their metabolisms. We're going to interrupt their growth cycles. We're going to mess them up psychologically. And we're putting them at enormous risk of developing an eating disorder. Yeah. What the hell are we thinking? This is where weight-centric thinking has got us. We are so bought into the hysteria of the dreaded obesity epidemic that we will risk the psychological and metabolic health of kids.
Yeah.
On a whim. And they got $1 million of NH and MRC research money to do this experiment. Wow. So I was horrified. I wrote a complaint to the ethics committee that approved it, saying, what the hell, listing all of the data on eating disorder risk associated with dieting, listing all of the, non-results that have been found from intermittent fasting in other populations, and sort of pleading to not do this. Yeah. And I got huge amount of support. I had 30 other health professionals and eating disorder professionals who co-signed the complaint.
Yeah.
And essentially we were rejected. They kind of came back saying, look, we'll make some tweaks. Really, we'll still do it, but we'll make some tweaks. And what the tweaks that we'll do is it will increase the amount of assessments we're doing to pick up eating disorders.
Yeah.
So, which, and essentially kind of saying we hear what you're saying, but these kids might lose weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or more just like, okay, we'll add that in as a tick box exercise because you've raised it, but we don't really consider it an issue.
It felt like that. Yeah, we don't really agree with the entire eating disorders community because we are an obesity research centre.
Yeah.
So, and there's a long-standing history here of tension between clearly, eating disorder community and the obesity research community, but, it really was a dismissal. So I complained again to the head of the Westmead Hospital and got knocked back again. So I complained again to the Australian Research Integrity Council, who said, look, we can't do anything. And so that's when I decided to start a petition because I thought the only thing we can do is to really raise public awareness of what's happening.
Yeah.
If this is going to run, it's going to run, but let's try to, gather some interest and some awareness of like how much protest there's been amongst professionals. So I started the petition and like it went a bit nuts. Like I got more than 20,000 signatures, and that's when the eating disorders organisations got involved. So we had the Australian New Zealand Association for Eating Disorders saying this trial should be stopped. We had the Academy for Eating Disorders in also saying this needs to be stopped. We had Feast, so the families of eating disorder also released a statement saying this needs to be stopped. Hayes Australia released one saying it should be stopped. Even the Japanese Eating Disorders Association released a statement saying it should be stopped. Wow. And it hasn't been stopped.
Yeah. And the thing with this as well is it gives the illusion of safety because it's being run as a trial, because there's all of these doctors involved, like that it could be just so alluring for someone who desperately wants their body to change, which is like basically every teenager. But like in this realm, if your parents are saying, look, we think this would be a good idea, and you're a teenager who's already thinking about dieting or whatever, and you're like, great, I've got this study I can get involved with. They're going to help me do this in the most professional way, the most scientific way, etc. Like I can imagine why this would be alluring for people.
Oh, totally alluring. And the locations of where this is being run are in lower socioeconomic areas with kids from, non-English speaking backgrounds, from Indigenous backgrounds. So there's that. And there's also the issue we were talking earlier about informed consent. The consent form says, after a lot of battle, we got them to, because at first the consent form said, we don't expect any problems to come out of this.
Wow.
And after a lot of battle, a sentence got added saying some people think that eating disorder risk can be increased from adolescent dieting, but we don't believe that to be the case. And then they refer to a meta-analysis that has been co-written by the authors, by the people who are involved in the trial, they've published this meta-analysis. That's another whole story.
Wow.
Because I wrote a letter to the editor about that meta-analysis, complaining about it.
Did they do that meta-analysis post you kicking up a stink about all of this?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I don't think it was. I think it was all part of it. They're really trying very hard to create like a paper trail and a set of, I guess, authority in this area. The meta-analysis suffered from poor quality included data, follow-up data on like less than, I think, 10%, like long-term follow-up data was less than 10% of the entire sample.
Yeah.
It was just shoddy. But that's what they put in the consent form now, saying, look, some people believe that this increases risk, but we've found no evidence that it increases risk, and then, refer to their paper. So, it looks legit.
Yeah.
The problem is that if you don't look for something for long enough or hard enough, it won't be found.
Totally. I mean, the thing is, if you're looking at a trial like this that runs for a year, the most likely outcome as part of this is there will be some weight loss, and it will be heralded as a success, but it's typically not, it's either not long enough for an eating disorder to develop for a lot of people, or it's not long enough for it to be identified as an eating disorder for a lot of people, meaning there will be a lot of the people who are actually pushing the numbers in the right direction as far as the researchers are concerned are going to be the ones that are most celebrated, who are going to be the ones that actually make this look like it's a success. And then 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line, however long, that's when, okay, this is now seen as an eating disorder and this person now is in treatment. And then however many years or decades that then goes on for.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's like the cigarette thing. It's like, well, look, if if we measure, how many people have lung cancer a year later, no one does sell the cigarette. It's shoddy. And I did put both of those points in all of the complaints, and it seemed like that just wasn't attended to.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because one of the meta-analysis, one of the studies that they referred to as evidence of not raising the risk of an eating disorder, I found a person who was in that study who had developed an eating disorder and written a blog about it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
And she was admitting that she was listed in the study as a success story because she dutifully lost a lot of weight and she was stuck in that honeymoon phase. Everyone thought she was fantastic, but now she has this disordered relationship with food. And of course the weight, hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing, like even if no one in this group goes on to develop an eating disorder, a very high percentage will have disordered eating and will have this like forever impact on their relationship with food. I mean, even when we look at the Minnesota Starvation experiment, even when you're interviewing the guys 60 years later, they talk about this like forever having an impact on them. And I mean, it makes sense. You were starved. Well, in their case, you were starved for 6 months. And in this case, you're going to be starved for a year. Like that is going to have an indelible mark. Yeah,
absolutely. And, when we see weight loss at all costs as uniformly positive, we don't think like this. But you're right. But the Minnesota thing, the thing that's so powerful about it is it wasn't called the Minnesota fast track. It wasn't seen as a good thing. They didn't gussy it up as anything except what it was, and so they were able to not gaslight themselves.
Yes.
But these poor kids and anyone involved in a weight loss study now, especially if you get the early success, there's a big chance that you're going to gaslight yourself, and when the weight comes back, because it will, because your body's awesome, you're going to blame yourself for something that really isn't your fault.
Yeah. Totally. Because, with the Minnesota Starvation experiment, they were looking out for all of these psychological problems and were kind of expecting that they were going to start happening. And even, I think it was in week 15, they knew how much the guys were struggling. So they gave them a massive meal as kind of a way of keeping up the motivation, but knowing that just how hungry they really were and how difficult this really was. And you're just going to be looking at this from a completely different perspective as part of this trial. You're not coming at it from a place of compassion of like, okay, this is really hard and we're just going to get you through this starvation phase, and then we can start to look at how the recovery process is. Like, they don't want a recovery process. They want to, okay, we end the starvation phase and then we keep you there.
Yes, somehow, but we
Yeah.
won't really bother about it because we won't really be following you up for very long.
Yes.
Interestingly, after a lot more pushback and pressure on the fast track, they have introduced another year of follow-up, but they've made it non-compulsory. So it's, and, and we were saying you need at least 5 years follow-up. There's no longitudinal data. If you've got all this money and you're going to do this, then look at the whole longitudinal process. 1 year is not adequate. 2 years isn't adequate. And, there's a lot of arguments and bowing of violins about how hard it is to get money, but, that's a lot of money. Yeah.
And I feel so bad for the teenagers that are going enrolled in this, because I know what I was like as a teenager. And I didn't have an issue around being too heavy. I was the opposite. I was like the tiniest kid in my whole year. There is a year photo taken of the whole school. And I think I was in year 8 or year 9 at the time, and it looks like I'm standing in the wrong year. Like there is just that much difference between me and everyone else. And if I had been in a household where there was a big deal made about that, and there was a trial that was then being run where they were able to give me some pharmaceutical drugs or do something that would promise to make me taller, make me more muscly, and my parents were saying that I should do this, like I can't guarantee I wouldn't have been like, yep, sign me up.
Of course. And that's the thing, when we have unexamined weight bias, when we uncritically accept the idea that any kind of that body diversity is a disease or a disease waiting to happen that must be controlled or managed, that then we get the kind of, well, whatever it takes mentality, and so much harm is caused.
Yeah. And the sad thing with this as well is, and you touched on this as part of the podcast, and it would be, I think, useful to go through, is this is off the back of a pilot study that apparently was like, oh, we'll do this pilot study, and this pilot study was a success, and that's why we need to roll this out to more people. But it was clearly not a success. So do you remember the details of the pilot study? Do you want to talk about that?
I will call them up from the dredges of my mind.
I've got some notes so I can add in any other details.
They recruited 30 teens from they've got a hospital-based obesity clinic, and they ran it for 6 months under a dietitian. So there wasn't any psychologists or any eating disorder specialists involved. And for 12 weeks, they all got Octafast and allowed just 600 to 700 calories a day for 3 days of the week. And then the rest of the week, they were told to follow the healthy eating guidelines. And then after the 12 weeks, the teens were invited to either keep doing the intermittent fasting stuff or change to like doing intermittent fasting for 2 days or 1 day of the week. Or they could swap to continuous calorie restriction for 3 months. They're also giving a Fitbit for some reason, which was never mentioned again in the study. So 12 weeks, what happened? They lost on average, I'm going to mention kilograms, everyone, I'm sorry. So 12 weeks, they lost on average 3.5 kilos. By 6 months, they had regained 1.5 kilos. So overall, there was a difference of 2 kilos after 6 months of starving, and they didn't find any health improvements. There was a super responder in the data, which sort of skewed the results, and 1/3 of the kids dropped out before it ended. And also we saw dietary restraint scores. So they did an eating disorder risk thing, and a dietary restraint score increased. Dietary restraint is a strong predictor of eating disorder symptomology. So that's the successful pilot that has managed to get the fast track $1.3 million of funding and 186 more kids recruited to do this for a whole year.
Yeah. I mean, it's insane. Like the fact that within 8 weeks, 7 people had dropped out. By the end of the 6 months, there were 4 or 5 who were actually at a higher weight than when they started. There was no positive changes in any of the markers. I think there was one marker that you mentioned that was kind of convoluted, connected to the heart, but it was a tiny thing that changed, and everything else there was no improvements. They didn't check periods, so menstrual function for any of the females. They didn't check anything to do with basal metabolic rate. And so all of these didn't move in the right direction or weren't checked. And then the thing that is alarming in terms of the dietary restraint score did move in the wrong direction. And yet this is considered a success. And then the other one was they had a quality of life score, and that improved, but it improved connected to weight loss.
Only 2 of the 7 measures improved.
Yeah.
And those improvements were directly tied to how much weight the kid had lost. So we know that weight regain is going to happen, and so quality of life, if it's tied, will go down again. Yeah. So all we're seeing is that kids who are forced to lose weight will feel better about themselves in the short term because it's been tied to their weight loss.
Yeah.
That's not quality of life.
No. And it's definitely not sustainable.
Yeah, I'm getting all fired up again just thinking about it.
Yeah. And so you also had some fairly direct run-ins with them about this trial.
Well, they didn't love the pushback. They didn't love the attention that the petition got. And there was also quite a bit of media interest that started to happen with the petition gathering strength and all the eating disorder organisations pitching in, because that doesn't happen very often. I mean, a study has to be pretty controversial to get that much interest, right? So they definitely didn't like it. And there were a couple of interviews about they didn't like me even writing that blog, for example. I had a picture in there of a table that they've used in their pilot study, and I got an official letter saying I was breaching copyright and had to change it. So I drew a cartoon version and put it in, and that was okay.
Yeah, it is fun. Like when I Google fast track trial, you are on the first page of Google in terms of that blog post.
I'm so proud of that, because I'm very proud that just me, a little overworked clinical psychologist, not just me, but the entire eating disorder community, everyone who was so awesome and signed the petition. Like basically little people can do big stuff and get big attention.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Google thing's interesting. So because I got frustrated that no one was listening, the trial was going ahead. And apart from the petition, there was nowhere that all the information about the protest and about the facts about risk of teenage dieting and eating disorders wasn't out there. So I noticed that the domain name fasttracktrial.com.au was for sale. So I bought it and, launched the website, which is about, I guess, the controversy surrounding the fast track trial. And that's a great source if anyone's interested in finding out more about what happened and all of the pushback and all of the information that we gathered. But I'm heartened knowing that if people are Googling to find out about the fast track trial, that they'll be able to find that website and see that this is not, the consent form's not really covering all of the issues that have been raised by hundreds of people about this trial.
Yeah. I love the fact that you bought the .com.au domain name and they hadn't bought it and they just had the .com domain name. That's great.
Yeah, that was great until I got a legal letter contesting. They got quite annoyed and they wanted me to take it down. They wanted me to give them the domain name. So we ended up in this whole legal process, and they set some really expensive lawyers against me and against the site being up. To the extent that I had to go and get a lawyer myself because I hadn't run into this before. The lawyer's advice was, oh, my God, they've thrown the big guys at you. Like this is an expensive legal company. They're probably on a retainer of, he said, at least like they don't even touch things for less than $50,000. So you're in trouble. I'm like, oh. So he said he'll help me. So I had to write, there was 75 points that I had to respond to. And the lawyer was like, just you're probably going to lose, but, just respond. So I did respond, and I used the whole, free speech. We're allowed to dissent. This is not, I think they were trying to imply that I was just trying to get clients for myself. by like misdirecting people from the fast track trial. Anyway, it took a long time, but eventually I won, which made me very happy.
Yeah.
And that's why the fasttracktrial.com.au is still up.
Yeah.
There's also a Facebook group, about it's called Stop the Fast Track Trial. Like this is not just me. This is, a group of horrified people who, our kids, our teenagers deserve much better than this.
Yeah.
In preparation for this podcast, I had a look at their trial registration page because I guess I live in the optimistic hope that it would just sort of fade away and people wouldn't inflict this on their kids, particularly, because COVID has happened.
Yeah.
The thought, like when it hit, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, 186 Aussie kids being starved in a pandemic, that just feels even worse. But when I tracked the trial registration, it's still running. They're still recruiting. That
was what I found as well, because I was like, I wonder if this has started. And I looked and I was like, it seems like they're still trying to get people on board.
They are. They've got 99 kids and it sat on 86 for ages and ages and ages. So, people aren't flocking.
Yeah.
I have a suspicion or hunch that probably, through the obesity clinics that operate in Sydney and Melbourne, the kids are getting recruited there.
Yeah.
But I really feel for those kids.
Yeah, definitely. But I think the fact that your website is still up, as soon as you're a parent who's like, cool, yeah, I'm thinking about this, and I'll just do a Google. Hopefully they're seeing your site. There's a great documentary. There's two of them actually called The Yes Men, and then I think The Yes Men Strike Again. Have you come across either of them?
No.
So they are two guys who do a similar thing to what you did in terms of they will set up websites that look very similar to some other company's website and then wait for someone to contact them. And so they'll set up a website that looks like DuPont's website, or they'll set up a website that looks like some company that has screwed people over, and then wait to get invited to go on Sky News or whatever as like a talking head as part of it. And then they'll go on and then basically just apologize on behalf of the company that there was that oil spill and I'm really sorry, and then just kind of get out of there as quickly as possible and then leave the companies to try and deal with the fact that they've gone online and said all this stuff. They have real balls in terms of what they do and the conferences they turn up to and present at, but it is hilarious, the stuff that they get away with.
Yeah. Well, I've yet to be invited to speak about the fast track at any conferences. So happy to be invited.
Yeah. With time.
Yeah.
So let's move on then to the second of your podcast. So the Obesity Collective.
Okay.
So tell me, like, how did this one all get started?
Oh God, that was a massive rabbit hole that literally started from me and a colleague, Mandy Lee, who I did the podcast with, laughing at the Obesity Australia's dodgy PDF handouts that they had at the time. So I can't remember why we were looking at the Obesity Australia website because, as anti-diet practitioners, sometimes we check out what they're doing.
Yeah.
And there was like this handout written by one of the original founders of Obesity Australia. It was just the most ridiculous weight loss tip sheet. It felt like it was from like 1935. Like saying things like, if you're hungry, snack down on Miss Muffet's favourite tipple, curds and whey. It's just weird, bizarre stuff. And I cannot remember what happened from there, but basically we looked a little more at Obesity Australia and started to see a concerning kind of push to get obesity classified as a disease here in Australia. And, it's no secret that Obesity Australia have a long history of being funded by pharmaceutical companies or bariatric surgery supply companies, but through a little more research about Obesity Australia, we found this thing called the Obesity Collective, which is based at the University of Sydney, which is kind of like the Obesity Australia revamped, like 2.0, making it look much more trendy and slick, run by the Charles Perkins Centre, which is this amazing interdisciplinary group of professionals and researchers all kind of plugging away at this obesity epidemic. And essentially what we found was like huge connections with Novo Nordisk, which is a pharmaceutical company who manufacture the weight loss drug Saxenda. And Saxenda was approved by the TGA here in Australia in 2015. And since 2015, it feels like Novo Nordisk have just been like kind of flying in and funding any obesity organisation that moves. Loads of medical professionals, GPs, doctors, obesity researchers, like it's just kind of this huge effort to raise awareness of obesity as this dreadful problem that needs medical management.
Yeah. And it seems as though, as you talked about in the podcast, is the goal with making it be classified as a disease is that you can then get drugs onto the PBS, so the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, which means in Australia that then, is it subsidised by the government, or you then get those drugs for free as the individual and the government is the one who's paying for them?
Yeah, the government, will pay a fair whack. So it's like, printing money for pharmaceutical companies. And there was a series of articles written by journalists for Crikey, they dug into this before Mandy and I had looked at it. They had calculated like a multi-billion-dollar profit that could come from increasing the sales of Saxenda. And Novo Nordisk also have another weight loss drug in development that's pretty close to coming to market in various countries. So the head of Novo Nordisk has been quoted as saying that obesity, is the next, big thing. And it's a market that doesn't have a lot of competitors. And so Novo Nordisk are really looking to dominate the global market.
Yeah.
And they're not just, there's been a lot of hoo-ha and stink about, paying medical professionals or paying obesity researchers to produce stuff that supports their kind of push. But what seems to be happening now is that then they're getting more savvy and not just paying people, but creating the research questions and the research agendas and the societies that talk about obesity. So there's the whole narrative is being created by Novo Nordisk, and it's like our universities and our associations are kind of becoming giant marketing departments for Novo Nordisk. It's just crazy.
And it is because it's in the shadows. And that, like, it would be one thing if this was Novo Nordisk, who were the ones that were always saying this, and anytime someone was on the screen, it had below them employee Novo Nordisk. But they're not. It's like, let's create the Obesity Collective. And basically the Obesity Collective, just for all intents and purposes, is a front for Novo Nordisk. But it then has this air of being something different to being, collective sounds lovely and trendy and great. And yeah, it feels like it's something separate when actually it really isn't.
Yeah. Well, they're very insistent on, and I think on their website, which is brand new and revamped, that not all of their funding comes from industry, that it also comes from government and comes from, various other places. But, also University of Sydney's own research has shown that even if, you're bought a cup of coffee by a pharma company, that's going to influence your agenda. So it doesn't really matter that it's not solely funded by Novo Nordisk, although the launch party for the Obesity Collective was completely funded by Novo Nordisk.
Yeah.
It's just really terrifying I think, to see just how big this agenda building is getting here in Australia. There's a patient group called the Weight Issues Network that was funded by Novo Nordisk. There's what are they called? The NACOS, the National Association for Clinical Obesity Services, which is all the hospital-based obesity services, have kind of gathered together to become one organisation. That organisation was funded by Novo Nordisk, and Novo Nordisk paid PricewaterhouseCoopers to prepare this report on how bad the obesity epidemic is and how much we need funding for surgery and weight loss drugs. It's like all of the conclusions coming out of all of these places are calling for the same thing.
Yeah. And part of the reason why the Obesity Collective is able to get money from government is probably because of the funding from Novo Nordisk, making it seem like it's a bigger deal than it really is, making it seem like it's not just a front for this pharmaceutical company. And without that initial push and getting set up, then there wouldn't be any funding from any other sources.
Well, Obesity Australia's always had funding from pharma. Yeah. But I think, joining with a university, a legitimate university with professors and, research and, all the legitimacy that a university brings, yes, that a private obesity organisation doesn't have. Like, it's really up to the kudos factor.
Yeah.
And University of Sydney are known for investigating conflict of interest and the influence of industry on research. But interestingly, when you check out their policy on partnerships with industry in universities, which is a big deal, it needs to be talked about. That one of their first points is that it's very important that universities do partner with industry.
Okay, that seems a bit weird.
Yeah.
Okay, if we call it a partnership, it's fine. If we call it influence, it's not fine. It seems like you're getting into semantics there.
It just feels like they're saying it's a bad thing. All the research says it's a bad thing, but it's also really important.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it's exhausting.
It is. And I think the thing that was highlighted a lot as part of this podcast, and what I think is potentially the thing that is most troubling with this, is the way that they are then using weight stigma as the drum that they're trying to beat to legitimize this somehow, to circumvent certain things. So talk about that, because I think that's a really important part of this.
Yeah, that literally makes my blood boil, because as you know, anti-diet people, eating disorder people, people who are decent think weight stigma sucks. Yep. And weight stigma is the idea that thinness is better than bigness, and weight stigma comes with all kinds of costs to society. To see an obesity organisation beat the drum, like you said, about how bad weight stigma is, grinds my gears enormously.
Yeah.
But the reason they think weight stigma is bad is because it stops larger people from getting access to weight loss services.
Yes.
It's like saying homophobia gets in the way of gay conversion therapy. Can you stop co-opting really important concepts in the service of serving up the same old? But this push, about it, this is part of Novo's thing as well. It's about getting obesity recognised as a disease, but it's also about getting weight stigma recognised as terrible. And I think it's a very clever marketing ploy, because it will ensure that they can onboard all of the body image researchers and the weight stigma researchers, the psychologist that was involved in the fast track trial. If people in the weight loss industry can pretend that they care about weight stigma, then they can get the other side on board.
Yeah.
And then, we're just sitting ducks.
Yeah.
So there's just been a new research paper called the Joint International Consensus on Weight Stigma. Doesn't that sound impressive? that's been released, and this was created, I guess, it's got 60 authors or 70 authors, like it's ridiculous. And it's supposed to be this joint consensus statement, but the whole paper was raised by Obesity Canada in conjunction with the Canadian Bariatric Surgeons Society. Obesity Canada's biggest sponsor is, you guessed it, Novo. Half the people who wrote the paper on weight stigma have multiple ties to pharmaceutical or bariatric surgery money.
Yeah.
And guess what? You will not believe what they're concluding in the weight stigma paper.
That weight stigma gets in the way of people requesting surgery or drugs to help with weight
pretty
stigma.
Much. Yeah, pretty much. Like there's some really good bits in there about like how bad weight stigma is, but like the main push is that we really need more surgery and drugs. Like it's next level. We're being completely brainwashed by this massive outsourced marketing department of Novo Nordisk, and it outrages me that, weight stigma is serious. Weight stigma leads to people dying on the table from being operated on because of their size. Weight stigma gets in the way of people getting jobs. Weight stigma in Australia, if you are above a certain BMI, you can't get IVF.
Yeah. Same with over here.
Yeah, that's discrimination. I mean, over there in Britain, the little kid who got taken off his parents for being big.
Yeah.
That's an example of weight stigma. But in all of this joint international consensus on weight stigma, issues like this were not put as priorities.
Yeah.
When these people talk about weight stigma, they're like, oh, weight stigma is terrible. How do we get back to the business of making people smaller?
Yes. Yeah, it's not even close to weight stigma is what they're referring to, because in the same breath that they're saying we worry about weight stigma, they're talking about the fact that we need to get people into smaller bodies, that we want them to be healthier in inverted commas, and healthier always means, with all their writing, slimmer, smaller, however you want to phrase it. So it's like, this is not about weight stigma for them. This is about something completely different. But I mean, kudos to them in terms of like, I can see why they're doing this. Like it works.
Yeah, they're definitely getting a lot of attention, and they're not getting any red flags raised, or except for like, in certain areas of the world.
Yeah.
Because they're like legitimacy washing, they're making themselves look really caring and lovely.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, what a complete, am I allowed to swear?
You could swear. You can go for it.
All right. What a complete mind fuck to say that we are going to prevent fat people from existing and prevent weight stigma.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing.
You're either doing one or the other. You can't do that. It's
just maddening. And here's another example. Dr. Arya Sharma is a bariatric surgeon in Canada, one of the bigwigs in Obesity Canada. He was flown out here on Novo Nordisk money to educate the Weight Issues Network. For some reason. In one of his presentations, he's talking about weight stigma. And he's talking about how sometimes when people go to the doctor and say, because this is his actual thinking, he's like, people go to the doctor and say, I'm really unhappy, in my body. And the doctor says, oh, you'll be okay, because the doctor doesn't take weight seriously enough. And so he's saying that is an example of weight stigma.
I'd also say when are people in larger bodies, majority of the time if they're going to the doctor, no matter what it is, it's, have you tried losing weight?
Yes, I've got, I've been impaled. Have you tried losing weight? So I don't feel like, it's ignored and just brushed to the side. If anything, it is made the most salient point, even if it's not remotely connected to what is going on. Yeah, it's just next level.
Yeah, I was having a read through on their website, and they actually have a whole PDF
Yeah.
that they've created about health at every size. And
That happened after I think after the second podcast went out, or maybe after the first one. So they've put out a whole thing on Haze Australia, which I'm immensely flattered about.
Yeah. Well, they said that they are basically in agreement with everything that Health at Every Size feels and says and thinks, but they feel that it is stigmatizing to not give people the medical options to lose weight if they want to.
I just don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that, like, again, we're talking the difference between gay conversion therapy and, like, let's just go to Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
We're not the same. We are not the same. Yeah. And there's that. And then that idea of it's stigmatizing to deny people drugs and surgery is next level. It is not stigmatizing. Stigma is the injustice that happens as a consequence of people living in larger bodies when they're devalued to the extent that they have been.
Yeah. Yeah. When they think that surgery or drugs is the smart choice, the only choice. Yeah.
I mean, what a blatant advertisement for who's funding them.
Yeah. Well, there was another quote on their site that said, we need to have communities where health and well-being are more important than the profits of a few industries. And I was just like, I don't quite understand the logic of that sentence given what you guys are about. Like the complete irony here of, like, this is about the profits of a few industries.
Oh, they said that out loud. That's hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it is totally gaslighting.
Yeah.
Because what they're actually doing, although they speak often about transparency, and I do think that there are some efforts on their part to disclose funding, for example, because they've responded to requests that we've made and to emails that we've written. Not all of them, but some of them have been responded to. But yeah, I think it's really cheeky to put statements like that when what they're actually doing is very, very much in the service of profit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in your podcast, you basically say that they talk about that on one of their presentations in the slides is kind of like the steps to get all of these things to be able to maximize profits.
Yeah, that's Novo Nordisk. They actually presented their agenda to Obesity Australia. Yeah. So I don't know, like, nothing's changed. Just because you write sentences on a website professing something doesn't mean that, your behaviour is any different.
Yeah. And do you know much about the drug Saxenda and, like, how the drug works or supposedly works?
Yeah, it doesn't light up the world. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, it's the same old story with any weight loss drug. There was, the papers that have been written on Saxenda that have been funded by Saxenda show excellent results, but, they're not long-term.
Yeah.
So, we're going to find the same thing that we found with every other weight loss drug.
Yeah.
We're going to find some short-term change, and then we're going to find some long-term outcomes. One of the things that I'm noticing here in Australia is that it's very expensive, and it's only supposed to be used for a certain amount of weeks. I think it's 12 weeks. But informally on Facebook groups of people who are taking it, they're talking about how their GPs are recommending they stay on it for much longer.
And much longer being, okay, let's do it for 6 months or a year, or much longer being, actually, this is a lifetime drug you can take forever.
I've read both of those comments in threads. So, and we get back to the problem of the pharmaceutical companies funding GPs, paying GPs to go to talks about Saxenda, and at least the good thing that we have here is you can research your health professional to see if they've received a payment from Novo Nordisk. So I encourage my clients to do that. If they've been recommended a weight loss drug by their health professional, to just check out, have they been paid?
How do you do, like, what's the website or what's the register that you can go and check that at?
I'll give it to you for the show notes because I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay.
But, a really quick and easy way of doing it is Google the name of your health professional and then just write Novo Nordisk, because that can pull up payments. But that only works if they're health professionals here in Australia.
Okay, that's really, really good to know. When I went and had a look at Saxenda, it was interesting because it says, like, take it, and we also encourage you to reduce your calories and up your exercise alongside it. So it's always like, is it the drug, or is it the changes to diet and exercise that are actually making the difference? But they are also very, like, in multiple places on the site, it says, like, this is not a stimulant. So I guess that there's a lot of people who've tried stimulants before, and they want to be very clear that this is not the same as that.
Yeah, no, they're not the same, but they're not terribly, I remember reading something on the TGA website about some kind of side effect they were concerned about, and I can't off the top of my head remember what it was, but that's the thing, like these are new. We don't have, that's right, I think longer term research was requested by the TGA. So yeah, we're in new territory, but also, like, even looking at the papers, we're not seeing anything to write home about with weight loss drugs. We never have. Like, weight loss drugs are not that effective, and they tend to have this, like, pesky problem of killing people. So
yes.
I'd be very wary.
Or the ones that are so-called effective, where you are dropping massive amounts of weight, is when you are pretty dead pretty quickly.
Unfortunately, yeah. And of course, you can't stay on it forever, and then there's the after effect, metabolic complications, like basically metabolic slowing after you finish some of these medications. We often see a bigger rebound. So, the more weight you lose, the more likely you are to regain more when you stop taking it. So, and the main thing for me is it's so expensive.
Yeah.
So, gosh, you could spend your money on so much more fun stuff.
But again, that's why they're wanting to get it on the PBS, so that it opens up a massive market, because it's then much more either free or much more affordable for people.
And it's much more normalized, right? So
totally.
the Novo Nordisk mantra, create legitimacy and urgency for the medical management of bigger bodies. So the more we normalize taking drugs and getting surgery, the better for these industries. But, I really cannot see the problem with going down the different route of just looking after people in diverse bodies without first doing any harm. Yeah. Which is, what the anti-diet stuff is all about.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement with you on that front. And it is, you talk about once you go off the drugs, all the problems that occur, and that's why then people go back on it. I remember listening to a podcast about fen-phen, and even when it was banned, people were continuing to buy it on eBay or finding ways of getting it, because they're like, I'm going to put up with this risk because I can't deal with the fact that I've now come off this and the weights come back.
Right, thinness at all costs.
Yeah.
Thinness at all costs. Yeah, people will, in a world that really devalues larger bodies, people will get desperate, and that's why, again, I just don't think this kind of path is one we necessarily will go down without terrible cost.
Yeah. And I know you alluded to in one of the podcasts on this that this is not going on in just Australia. This is happening in other countries around the world. And I think you made reference to the fact that it's in the UK. Is there a front in the UK in the same way that there is the Obesity Collective in Australia? Is there an organisation in the UK that you know of that is a front for Novo Nordisk?
Not that I know of. So Canada is Obesity Canada. Is the big one. I've had messages from people in Europe, so Denmark, and I think Sweden as well. And in the UK, it's interesting because that is where the World Obesity is based there. Is that right?
I'm I don't know the answer to that question. I will fact check and add something, add a note.
Yeah. Like basically there are cells everywhere.
Yeah.
That's it. The World Obesity Federation is based, I think, in London. The World Obesity Federation, the biggest funder is, you'll never guess.
Novo Nordisk.
Yeah, absolutely. And the new president-elect actually is the lead researcher of the fast track trial.
Okay, wow. So it is all connected.
Basically the entire world. That's why, it's like Novo Nordisk are like a global octopus.
Yeah.
Just putting out their tentacles all over the place and doing, I guess they've done most in Canada because, they've really made an effort to fund Obesity Canada to make it look very professional. And, there are genuine health professionals in there who genuinely care about their areas of study, right?
Yeah.
But this agenda is being kind of put through the air conditioning.
Yeah.
So they've definitely done it in Canada. There's cells in the United States. There's this thing called, I think it's GOPA, which is the Global Obesity Patients Association, which is where all of the seated patient groups are being joined together into a global group. So, and all of it with this agenda. It's, so I find it so fascinating because we've all heard of the obesity epidemic and the obesity crisis, but when you really look at like where these messages are coming from, it's very engineered. And the idea that it's coming from like just a small group of pharmaceuticals who are going to profit is kind of chilling.
Yeah, it's like World Tobacco coming together and talking about how our lung capacity isn't as good as what it used to be, but we've got this really great solution that is going to save everyone, and that's why everyone should smoke.
Actually, I was watching something about vaping on Netflix, and I was watching how Philip Morris, the tobacco company, have just bought Juul, which is the world's biggest vaping company.
Yeah.
So, the perpetrators have now bought the solution. And I think, that's kind of how it feels with weight bias researchers and body image researchers and even eating disorder researchers being swallowed up by the octopus of obesity. It's globalization, and we need to fight back, and we can fight back. Like if little old me can keep my website going in the face of this, it's great that you're doing this podcast so we can get the information out there. Like we've got to be much more cynical when we hear stuff like on the news or read stuff in the newspaper. Like a lot of these reports that have been put out here in Australia about how bad the obesity epidemic is are really manufactured from these sources, these same places. So like I think the first 3 major obesity reports that were released between maybe 2011 and 2017, all funded by unlimited Novo funds.
Yeah.
So
and I always struggle to get my head around when they say that obesity costs whatever billions it is, of like, how do you actually calculate that number? Because I bet if I went down the line of mental health costs or poverty costs or like look through a different lens, I could catch a very big chunk of this anyway. And so it's like, if you want to look down it through that lens, like, you can come up with a number, but how accurate it really is another thing. And I think you mentioned this on the podcast as well, even though it's a really large number that they're talking about, when you compare the actual budget of how much then is spent on healthcare, it's a pretty tiny number, and it's a tiny number that's already heavily inflated
already
and made up anyway.
Yeah. Because don't you love it when they do how much it costs? They're like, here's the actual cost, which are like they've done some kind of calculation of healthcare costs, because every time a larger person needs healthcare, that's a crime.
Yeah.
But then they go like the projected costs, which are kind of like this imaginary cost of like, if this person existed but they weren't fat, this is how much money they'd make. It's just weird. And usually those projected costs are much bigger than the actual costs.
Yeah. Or basically anyone who's in a large body who is sick and had a sick day off work, and then that costs the economy. Well, that is because of their body. Like basically any person who is a large body, anything that goes wrong, it is then lumped in as part of that thing as opposed to anything else.
And it's just a really horrendous way of looking at our community.
Yeah.
It's like, it's sort of saying, if they're like, again, with the kind of gay conversion thing, like if there weren't any gay people, this is what the world would be like. Like, can you not do that? Because that's really mean.
Yeah.
People exist and it's okay, and maybe we can just like work with it.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Have you seen, when I was listening to these two podcasts that you've done on this, it made me think of another documentary called Tickled. Have you seen that by any chance?
Oh, yes. So weird.
Tickled is probably my favorite documentary of all time. And whenever I'm chatting about documentaries, it is the first thing that I mention. So if someone who is listening has not seen it, I highly recommend checking it out. It's about in competitive endurance tickling, which on the surface you're like, why would I ever want to watch a documentary about this? But this guy, David Farrier, finds it on the internet. He's a journalist in New Zealand and thinks, oh, this looks interesting. Maybe I'll do a story on it, and starts to make contact with them. And it just goes down the biggest, weirdest rabbit hole you just do not expect how it is going to end up. And I was just thinking, listening to this podcast, if you are going to get a documentary made on this, you need to reach out to David Farrier, and he is your man.
That's such a good idea. Because that's how it feels. Like, it feels like Mandy and I fell down this rabbit hole, especially with the Obesity Collective, that I'm still falling through. And like it gets bigger and weirder by the day. But, it's I'm just thinking of Tickled now. So trying to remember what happened, because that's the thing. Like, there's so many twists and turns. There's so many twists and turns here. And so many more things keep on happening that, I'm really dying to tell people about in the next 2 podcasts, because we're going to put one out on Saxenda and the other weight loss drug that is going to be put out, and then the other one just about like the global reach. And I have people like in Denmark, in Sweden, and in the UK burrowing in, because like what we're seeing, especially I think it's in Denmark, is how they're seeding it. It's just really fascinating.
Wow.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, listeners, please check out Louise's podcast, subscribe to All Fired Up, and then you can get those episodes when they come out, because I will definitely be listening. Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, no, this has been awesome. I'm really glad that you came on and we were able to have this discussion. And your investigative skills are amazing, and I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. And just that I know how much time it takes me just to run a practice and to see clients, and when I see everything you're doing in terms of setting up a website for the fast track trial, and then having to get a lawyer and deal with, like, my mind boggles at your ability to do all the things.
Yeah, you should see my house, though. I don't do housework, so this is where it falls down.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you so much for your time. This is awesome.
Thanks, Chris.
So that was my conversation with Louise. Her podcast is fantastic, and I recommend that you check it out. I actually forgot to ask Louise at the end where people should go to find out more information about her, and so I will do that now on her behalf. Her podcast is called All Fired Up. Her website is untrapped.com.au. Her Instagram is untrapped_au, and her Facebook page is Untrapped Community. So that is it for this week's show. As I mentioned at the top, I'm currently taking on new clients and I have just a couple of spots left. So this will be the last time that I mention it on the show. If you want help with recovery, body image, getting your period back, exercise compulsion, being stuck in quasi-recovery, or any of the areas that I cover as part of this show, please get in contact. You can go to 7-health.com/help for more information. I'll be back next week with another rebroadcast episode. Stay safe and I will catch you then.